The bullet tore through her ribcage at 0347 hours, and Irene Hill knew she had maybe 15 minutes before shock would take her under. Around her, the observation post burned, her squad was scattered, and enemy forces were closing in from 3 directions. She pressed her hand against the wound, felt the hot pulse of blood between her fingers, and made a decision that would either save her entire platoon or become the last mistake she'd ever make. What she did next with that blood would change military protocol forever. This is the story of the soldier they called too soft for combat until the night she painted a battlefield with her own body to guide an airstrike that shouldn't have been possible. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. Irene Hill had cried 3 times during her first week at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, and everyone knew it. The first time was during a particularly brutal training exercise when Sergeant Voss screamed in her face for failing to secure her position fast enough. The second was after she'd found a stray dog near the perimeter fence, half-starved and bleeding, and the medic told her they didn't waste supplies on animals. The third time was during mail call when a letter from her younger brother arrived, full of questions about whether war was like the movies, whether she was scared, whether she was brave. She'd hidden in the supply shed to read it, but Private Dalton had walked in and found her wiping her eyes. By dinner, the entire base knew. Emotional Irene, they called her. Sometimes just weepy when they thought she couldn't hear. At 22, Irene was one of the youngest intelligence analysts assigned to the base, a remote outpost in the mountainous border region where 3 countries met in a tangle of disputed territory and old grudges. She'd scored in the top 5% of her training class, had a gift for pattern recognition that her instructors called extraordinary, and could read topographical maps like most people read novels. None of that mattered here. What mattered was that she cried. What mattered was that she felt things too deeply. What mattered was that in a place where everyone built walls around their emotions to survive, Irene wore hers on the outside like an invitation to dismiss her. The morning briefing at 0600 was the same as always. Captain Wolf stood at the front of the operations room, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of tactical displays showing enemy movement patterns. Irene sat in her usual spot near the back, her tablet loaded with the overnight intelligence reports she'd compiled. "We've got increased activity in Sector 9, Wolf announced, gesturing to the map. Thermal signatures suggest a buildup of forces. Could be preparation for a push toward the valley." Irene's fingers moved across her tablet, pulling up the data she'd been analyzing since 0300. The pattern she'd identified wasn't in Sector 9. It was in Sector 12, a supposedly quiet area where enemy movements over the past week had formed a distinct pattern. Not random patrols, but coordinated repositioning. They were setting up for something bigger, using Sector 9 as misdirection. She raised her hand hesitantly. "Captain, I think we should consider." "Hill, if this is another one of your hunches, save it," Wolf interrupted without looking at her. "We need facts, not feelings." "It's not a hunch, sir. The data shows. The data shows enemy movement in Sector 9. That's where our focus needs to be." He turned to Lieutenant Reeves. "I want observation posts reinforced in Sectors 8 and 9. Double the watch rotations." Irene looked down at her tablet, at the carefully documented patterns she'd spent hours analyzing. She'd been right before. 3 weeks ago, she'd predicted an enemy supply route shift that everyone dismissed until it happened exactly as she'd said. But she'd cried during the debriefing when Wolf had casually mentioned it without crediting her analysis, and that's what people remembered. Not that she'd been right. That she'd been emotional about it. After the briefing, she approached Wolf's second-in-command, Lieutenant Reeves, a man who'd always been more willing to listen than most. "Sir, about Sector 12, she began, pulling up her analysis. "Look at these movement patterns over the past 7 days. The thermal signatures aren't random. They're establishing firing positions in a semicircle pattern. This is textbook preparation for a coordinated assault." Reeves studied the data, his expression thoughtful. "This is solid work, Hill. But you know how the captain is. He doesn't trust pattern analysis over direct intelligence. Direct intelligence is telling us to look at Sector 9, which is exactly what they want, Irene pressed. Sir, I know I don't have credibility here. I know people think I'm too emotional to be reliable. But this isn't about feelings. This is math. This is data. And it's telling us we're looking in the wrong direction. Reeves sighed, glancing toward Wolf's office. I'll mention it to him. But Hill, you need to understand something. In combat, people trust soldiers who keep their heads under pressure. Every time you let your emotions show, you lose a little more credibility. Fair or not, that's reality. So I should stop feeling things? Irene asked, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. You should stop showing it, Reeves replied, not unkindly. There's a difference. That afternoon, Irene volunteered for observation post duty in Sector 12. If Wolf wouldn't listen to her analysis, she'd gather first-hand intelligence that couldn't be dismissed. The observation post was a fortified position built into a rocky outcrop overlooking a narrow valley. It was considered a quiet assignment, the kind of duty given to soldiers who needed a break from the intensity of the active sectors. She arrived at 1800 hours to relieve Corporal Zhang, who seemed surprised to see her. Hill? What are you doing out here? Requested the assignment, Irene replied, setting down her gear. Wanted to get some field time. Zhang shook his head. Sector 12 is dead quiet. Nothing happens here. You're wasting your time. Maybe, Irene said, already setting up her observation equipment. Or maybe everyone's been looking in the wrong direction. As night fell, Irene settled into the routine of watch duty. The observation post was equipped with thermal imaging, night vision, and communication equipment linked directly to base command. She documented everything: wind patterns, temperature changes, the movement of nocturnal animals. Most soldiers would have found it mind-numbingly boring. Irene found it meditative. At 2,330 hours, her thermal imaging picked up something. 3 heat signatures moving along a ridgeline 2 kilometers distant. She tracked them, noting their speed and direction. They weren't animals. The movement was too purposeful, too coordinated. She reported it to base command. Sentinel, this is observation post 12. I have 3 thermal signatures, grid reference. Copy that, OP-12, came the board response. Probably local shepherds. Let us know if it becomes something. Irene kept watching. Over the next 2 hours, she counted 17 more signatures, all moving in the same general pattern she'd predicted. They were coming from different directions, converging on positions that would create a perfect ambush corridor for any forces moving through the valley. She reported each sighting, her voice growing more urgent with each call. Base command's responses grew more dismissive. OP-12, you're seeing shadows. Sector 12 is quiet. Sentinel, these aren't shadows. This is coordinated movement. You need to. Hill, is that you? Sergeant Voss's voice cut through the radio. Stop flooding the channel with false reports. If you can't handle observation duty without panicking, we'll pull you back. Irene stared at her displays, watching the thermal signatures continue their careful approach. She wasn't panicking. She was watching the setup for an assault that everyone at base refused to believe was happening. At 0315 hours, she made a decision. She activated her personal recording equipment and began documenting everything in detail. Timestamps, grid coordinates, movement patterns. If they wouldn't listen to her reports, she'd create a record that couldn't be dismissed later. At 0330 hours, her night vision picked up the first muzzle flash. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, just as her analysis had predicted. Mortar rounds bracketed the observation post as automatic weapons fire tore through the night. Irene dove for cover, her heart hammering as the world exploded into violence around her. Sentinel, this is OP-12. We are under attack. I repeat, we are under. The communications equipment exploded in a shower of sparks and shrapnel. Irene felt something hot slice across her shoulder as she scrambled toward the emergency radio. The backup communications were her only link to base now, the only way to warn them that the attack everyone said wouldn't happen was happening right now. She reached the emergency radio just as the second wave of fire hit the post. And somewhere in that chaos, in the moment between reaching for salvation and finding it, Irene Hill understood that being right wasn't enough. Being prepared wasn't enough. Sometimes survival meant being willing to do things that terrified you, that went against every instinct, that transformed you into someone unrecognizable. She just didn't know yet how unrecognizable she was about to become. The emergency radio crackled to life just as the observation post's western wall took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. The explosion threw Irene backward, slamming her against the reinforced interior wall hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. She tasted blood and dust, felt the ringing in her ears that signaled temporary hearing damage. Sentinel. OP-12, under attack. She gasped into the radio, her hands shaking as she tried to maintain her grip on the handset. Multiple hostiles, sectors 11 and 12, they used 9 as misdirection. Say again, OP-12? You're breaking up. Another explosion, closer this time. The observation post's roof groaned under the impact, and chunks of reinforced concrete rained down around her. Irene could hear voices outside now, shouting in a language she recognized from intelligence briefings. They were moving in for a ground assault. She'd been right about everything. The pattern, the positioning, the coordinated attack. And now she was going to die proving it because no one had believed her in time to matter. The thought came with surprising clarity. She could surrender. The observation post was indefensible, communications were failing, and she was alone. Surrender was the logical choice, the choice that kept you alive to fight another day. It was what her training said to do when the situation became untenable. But surrender meant the enemy would take the observation post intact. Meant they'd have access to the intelligence equipment, the tactical displays, the detailed maps showing all of Sentinel's defensive positions. Meant the attack on her base wouldn't just be a surprise, it would be a massacre. Irene looked at the emergency radio in her hand, then at the tactical map display still flickering on the far wall. The power was failing, but the screen showed exactly what she needed, enemy positions marked in red, based on her thermal imaging from the past 3 hours. All that data she'd collected while everyone told her she was seeing shadows. She wasn't seeing shadows. She was seeing the future, and the future was coming through the door in about 60 seconds. Irene made a decision that felt both insane and inevitable. She grabbed the thermite grenades from the weapons locker, the ones meant for destroying sensitive equipment. Then she pulled out every piece of intelligence material she could carry, stuffed it into her tactical vest, and prepared to do something her training had never covered, turn an observation post into a funeral pyre that would buy Sentinel base enough time to prepare. The first enemy soldier breached the door at 0342 hours. Irene was already moving toward the emergency exit, a narrow tunnel that led down the rocky outcrop toward the valley floor. She pulled the pins on 2 thermite grenades and dropped them among the equipment as she ran. The heat hit her back like a physical wall as the thermite ignited, temperatures soaring above 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The observation post's interior would be molten slag in minutes. Nothing would survive that inferno, least of all the intelligence the enemy needed. But Irene had underestimated how fast they were moving. As she emerged from the tunnel exit halfway down the outcrop, rifle fire exploded from 2 positions. She felt the first round hit her tactical vest, the impact spinning her sideways. The second round found the gap between her vest panels and punched through her ribcage on the right side. The pain was immediate and catastrophic. Irene stumbled, her hand instinctively pressing against the wound. Blood, hot and abundant, soaked through her uniform. She could feel the exit wound on her back, larger than the entrance. Through and through, which meant the bullet hadn't stayed inside to do more damage. Small mercies. She slid down the rocky slope, using gravity and desperation to put distance between herself and the shooters. Her radio was gone, lost somewhere in the tunnel. Her rifle was slipping from her grip as shock began to set in. She had minutes at best before she'd lose consciousness. Irene wedged herself between 2 large rocks, creating a hide position that gave her cover and a view of the valley below. In the pre-dawn darkness, she could see them now, dozens of enemy fighters moving into assault positions, preparing for the main attack on Sentinel Base. They'd used the observation post assault as cover for repositioning their entire force. Her hand was still pressed against her wound, blood pulsing between her fingers with each heartbeat. She pulled her hand away and looked at it, dark and slick in the dim light. Then she looked at the smooth rock surface beside her, pale gray granite that would show up clearly in aerial reconnaissance. The idea came with the strange clarity that sometimes accompanies severe trauma. She'd lost her radio. She'd lost her rifle. She was bleeding out in a hide position with no way to warn Sentinel about the enemy positions she could see arranging themselves for attack. But she had intelligence training. She had perfect visibility of enemy positions. She had tactical knowledge of how to mark coordinates for aerial strikes. And she had approximately 3 liters of blood that was currently soaking into the ground and doing no one any good. Irene reached into her tactical vest with her free hand, pulled out her personal notebook and a pen, and began to sketch the valley layout with shaking hands. She marked her position first, then began plotting enemy positions as she observed them. Each cluster of fighters got a reference number. Each weapon's emplacement got a priority designation. Then she pressed her bloody hand against the rock face and began to paint. The blood was the perfect medium. Dark enough to show contrast against the pale rock. Abundant enough that she didn't need to worry about running out, at least not for a while. She painted large alphanumeric codes next to each enemy position she'd marked in her notebook. Grid references that any pilot with tactical training would recognize. The pain was extraordinary. Each movement pulled at the wound, sent fresh waves of agony through her torso. Irene found herself making sounds she didn't recognize, animal noises of pain and effort. The emotional Irene, the one who cried during briefings and felt things too deeply, would have stopped. Would have given in to the pain and the fear and the certainty of death. But this Irene, the one painting a battlefield with her own blood at 0400 hours on a sunny morning that would soon reveal her work, this Irene had moved beyond emotion into something colder and more purposeful. This Irene was completing the mission with the only tools she had left. By 0430, she'd marked 17 enemy positions across the rock face. The blood codes were large enough to be visible from the air, clear enough to be read by anyone with tactical training. She'd created a targeting map using her body as ink, transforming her dying into something useful. The sky was beginning to lighten. Soon the sun would rise over the mountains, and the enemy would launch their assault on Sentinel. Unless someone saw her marks. Unless someone understood what she'd done. Unless her final intelligence report, written in blood on stone, reached the right eyes in time. Irene leaned back against the rock, her hand returning to press against the wound that was taking her life one pulse at a time. She thought about her brother's letter, about his questions concerning bravery. She thought about Sergeant Voss and Captain Wolf and all the people who'd dismissed her as too emotional, too soft, too weak for combat. She thought about how wrong they'd all been, and how right she'd been, and how none of that mattered anymore because the only thing that mattered was whether Sentinel survived the next hour. The sun broke over the mountains at 0447 hours, illuminating the valley in golden light. Irene watched it rise, her vision starting to narrow at the edges. She'd done everything she could. Written the report in the only medium she had. Marked the targets with the only tools available. Now all she could do was hope someone would read her final message before it was too late. Above her, she heard the distant sound of aircraft engines. Reconnaissance drones making their morning sweep. She looked up at them, then at her blood-marked coordinates gleaming wetly on the rock face in the early light. Please see it, she thought. Please understand. Then shock took her under, and Irene Hill slipped into darkness, not knowing if her message would be read, if her sacrifice would matter, if anyone would ever know that the emotional analyst had written her most important intelligence report with her own dying body. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. Captain Wolf was drinking his third coffee of the morning when the reconnaissance drone footage hit his desk at 0512 hours. The pilot who'd flown the dawn sweep, a veteran named Hayes, had flagged it as urgent and personally delivered the images rather than routing them through normal channels. "Sir, you need to see this immediately," Hayes said, spreading the photographs across Wolf's desk. The images showed the rocky outcrop where Observation Post 12 had stood. Past tense, because the structure was now a smoking ruin, exactly as Irene had intended. But that wasn't what had caught Hayes's attention. On the rock face below the destroyed post, clearly visible in the morning light, were marks. Dark streaks that formed letters and numbers. Grid coordinates. Target designations. Priority rankings. A complete tactical map written across 20 meters of granite and what appeared to be blood. "What am I looking at?" Wolf asked, though something cold was already forming in his stomach. "Intelligence markings, sir." Someone painted targeting coordinates for every enemy position in the valley. 17 distinct locations, all marked with proper military designation codes. Hayes pointed to the largest marking. "This is OP-12's location. And sir, the markings appear to be fresh. Very fresh." Wolf grabbed his own reconnaissance images from the previous day. The rock face had been clean then. Whatever had created these marks had happened in the last few hours. He thought about the garbled radio transmission they'd received from OP-12 at 0345. Hill's voice, barely coherent, something about an attack before the signal had died completely. "Get me thermal imaging of that valley." "Now," Wolf ordered, his voice tight. The thermal scans came back 3 minutes later and confirmed what the blood map had indicated. Enemy forces were staging in exactly the positions marked on the rock face. Not close to those positions. Exactly in those positions. 17 distinct groups, arranged for a coordinated assault on Sentinel Base, hidden in terrain features that made them nearly invisible to standard reconnaissance. But someone had seen them. Someone had documented them. Someone had marked them with such precision that Wolf could call in airstrikes using those coordinates and be confident of hitting legitimate military targets. Lieutenant Reeves appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Sir, I just reviewed Hill's intelligence reports from the past week. The pattern analysis she tried to show you. It predicted exactly this. A coordinated assault using Sector 9 as misdirection while they positioned forces in Sector 12. Wolf felt something twist in his chest. He dismissed her. Called her analysis a hunch. Told her they needed facts, not feelings. And she'd been right about everything. Hill was stationed at OP-12, Wolf said quietly. She volunteered for observation duty there yesterday. The room fell silent as the implications settled over everyone present. Hayes spoke first, his voice careful. "Sir, if those markings are what I think they are, if someone used their own blood to paint those coordinates, then whoever did it lost a significant amount of blood. Maybe all of it." "She tried to tell us," Reeves said, and there was something raw in his voice. "She tried to warn us about Sector 12. We wouldn't listen." Wolf stared at the photographs, at the careful precision of the markings despite what must have been extraordinary circumstances. Hill had been dying, alone, probably in severe pain, and she'd used her final minutes to complete an intelligence report that would save everyone who'd dismissed her. He reached for his radio. "All units, this is Wolf. We have confirmed enemy positions in Sectors 11 and 12. I want artillery coordinates locked on the following locations." He began reading off the grid references from Hill's blood map, his voice steady despite the weight settling over him. Within minutes, the base's artillery units were ranging their guns. Air support was being scrambled from the regional command. The attack that should have been a surprise, that should have devastated Sentinel, was about to become a catastrophe for the enemy instead. All because one analyst had refused to die quietly. "Sir," Hayes said hesitantly. "Should we send a recovery team for Hill?" Wolf looked at the photographs again, at the amount of blood visible on those rocks. The medical officer had already given his assessment. With that much blood loss, survival time was measured in minutes, not hours. They'd received Hill's partial radio transmission at 0345. It was now 0527. Prepare a recovery team, Wolf ordered anyway. If she survived long enough to paint that map, she survives long enough to be brought home. Irene regained consciousness to the sound of artillery fire. Thunder rolling across the valley in waves, each impact shaking the ground beneath her. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her entire right side felt like it was made of broken glass and fire. Then memory returned in a rush. The observation post. The attack. The bullet through her ribs. The blood map she'd painted while her life leaked away onto the rocks. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. The pain was transcendent, beyond anything she'd experienced. Her hand found the wound again, pressed against it with weak pressure. The bleeding had slowed, which was either a good sign or a sign that she'd already lost too much blood to maintain proper pressure. The artillery strikes were hitting the positions she'd marked. She could tell by the pattern, by the systematic way the explosions walked across the valley floor. Someone had seen her map. Someone had understood. The attack on Sentinel was being neutralized before it could begin. She'd done it. Completed the mission with her last reserves of strength and consciousness. Now she could let go, could slip back into the darkness that kept pulling at her. Her job was finished. But something stubborn in Irene refused to surrender. Maybe it was the same stubbornness that had driven her to volunteer for observation duty in Sector 12 when everyone said it was a waste of time. Maybe it was the part of her that had spent months being dismissed and underestimated and had quietly decided to prove everyone wrong. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she just wanted to see the look on Sergeant Voss's face when he realized the emotional analyst had saved the entire base. Irene forced her eyes open and assessed her situation with what remained of her analytical mind. She was wedged between rocks in a defensible position. Her wound had partially clotted, though any significant movement would restart the bleeding. She had no water, no medical supplies, no communication equipment. Enemy forces were being systematically destroyed by artillery, but survivors would be scattered throughout the valley, potentially passing within meters of her position. Survival required remaining completely still and completely silent for however long it took for recovery teams to reach her. If they came at all. If they knew she was still alive. If they could navigate the valley while artillery strikes were still falling. The rational part of Irene understood her chances were minimal. But she'd already done the impossible once this morning. Might as well try for twice. She focused on breathing. Slow, shallow breaths that didn't pull at the wound. Each breath was a small victory, a moment of continued existence in defiance of statistics and medical probability. The emotional Irene would have been terrified, would have cried, would have given in to the overwhelming fear of dying alone on a mountainside. This Irene had moved beyond fear into a strange state of calm acceptance. She'd done her job. Whatever happened next was just epilogue. The artillery fire continued for another 20 minutes, systematic and devastating. Through narrow gaps in her rock shelter, Irene could see smoke rising from the valley floor, could hear the secondary explosions as munitions caches were hit. The coordinated assault that should have overwhelmed Sentinel was being torn apart by the intelligence she'd provided. When the artillery finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise. Irene strained her ears, listening for sounds of movement. Enemy survivors. Recovery teams. Anything that would indicate she wasn't completely alone. She heard voices first. Distant, speaking that same language she'd heard during the initial assault. Enemy fighters, scattered and disorganized, trying to regroup after the artillery barrage. They were moving through the valley, and their path would bring them close to her position. Irene's hand found her sidearm, still holstered at her hip. She'd lost her rifle during the escape from the observation post, but she still had her pistol. 15 rounds against however many fighters were approaching. Not good odds, but better than nothing. She drew the weapon slowly, every movement agony. The pistol felt impossibly heavy in her weakened grip. She checked the chamber, confirmed it was loaded, then rested it against her thigh where she could bring it up quickly if needed. The voices grew closer. 3 fighters, maybe 4, moving cautiously through the rocky terrain. They were looking for survivors from the artillery strike, trying to understand what had happened to their carefully planned assault. One of them stopped less than 10 meters from Irene's position. Through the gap in the rocks, she could see him clearly, young, maybe her age, wearing mismatched tactical gear and carrying an assault rifle. He was looking at something on the ground, and his posture suggested confusion. Then Irene realized what he was looking at, her blood trail. Drops and smears leading from the observation post tunnel to her current position. She'd been too focused on survival to think about covering her tracks. The fighter called out to his companions, gesturing at the blood. They began following the trail, weapons raised, moving directly toward her hiding spot. Irene raised her pistol with both hands, her arms shaking from weakness and pain. The sight wavered in her vision as the fighter approached her position. 3 meters. 2 meters. 1 meter. Her finger found the trigger, and despite everything, despite the pain and blood loss and certainty of death, her hands were steady. The fighter was reaching for the rocks when the rescue helicopter appeared over the ridgeline. The sudden thunder of rotors made everyone freeze, the moment of confrontation suspended as both Irene and the enemy fighters looked up at the aircraft dropping into the valley like a mechanical angel. Door gunners opened fire immediately, their heavy weapons raking the exposed positions where the fighters had gathered. The young soldier near Irene's position dove for cover, his attention completely diverted from the blood trail he'd been following. His companions scattered, returning fire at the helicopter as it maneuvered for another pass. Irene lowered her pistol and pressed back into her rock shelter, making herself as small as possible. The rescue bird wasn't here for her yet, couldn't be. They would have headed for the observation post first, would be conducting standard search patterns. But their appearance had saved her from a confrontation she couldn't have won. The firefight lasted maybe 90 seconds. The helicopter's superior firepower and the fighters' exposed positions made it a one-sided engagement. When the door guns finally went silent, 3 bodies lay scattered across the rocks, and the valley had returned to its terrible quiet. Irene waited, listening. The helicopter was circling now, slower, searching. She could see it through gaps in the rocks, a medical evacuation bird, marked with the red crosses that should have made it non-combatable but everyone ignored in practice. The side doors were open, and she could see figures inside scanning the terrain. She needed to signal them. Needed to make herself visible before they completed their search pattern and moved on. But moving meant pain, meant possibly restarting the bleeding that had finally stopped. It meant choosing to be found rather than accepting the easier path of remaining hidden and slipping away. Irene thought about her brother's letter again, about his questions concerning bravery. She thought about all the times she'd been called too soft, too emotional, too weak. Then she thought about the blood map on the rocks above her and the artillery strikes she'd guided and the enemy assault she'd helped prevent. She'd already proven everything she needed to prove. But proving it meant nothing if she died proving it. With a grunt of effort that became a scream she couldn't suppress, Irene pulled herself partially out of her rock shelter. She raised one arm, waving weakly at the helicopter. The movement pulled at her wound and she felt fresh blood seeping through her uniform, warm and abundant again. The helicopter banked sharply, its rotors kicking up dust and debris. Someone inside had seen her. The aircraft descended rapidly, landing gear extending as it settled onto a relatively flat area about 30 meters from her position. Irene tried to move toward it but her legs wouldn't cooperate anymore. She'd used the last of her strength for that signal. Now she could only watch as figures jumped from the helicopter and ran toward her position in a crouch, expecting enemy fire. The first person to reach her was a medic she didn't recognize, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and hands that moved with practiced efficiency. He took one look at her wound and his expression tightened. "Found her," he shouted toward the helicopter. "GSW through and through, right side, massive blood loss. I need the stretcher now." More hands, more voices, all moving around her in organized chaos. Someone was cutting away her uniform to access the wound. Someone else was establishing in 4-line. A third person was monitoring her vital signs, calling out numbers that sounded bad even to her fading consciousness. "Hill, can you hear me?" The medic's face filled her vision. "Stay with me. We're getting you out of here." Irene tried to speak but only managed a weak sound. The medic leaned closer. "The map," she whispered. "Did they see it?" The medic's expression shifted, something like awe crossing his features. "Everyone saw it. You saved the whole base. Now let us save you." They lifted her onto the stretcher, and the movement sent fresh waves of agony through her body. Irene heard herself making sounds again, those animal noises of pure pain. The emotional Irene was still in there somewhere, feeling everything too deeply. But this time, that was okay. This time, her emotions had kept her alive long enough to be found. The helicopter lifted off with Irene secured inside, the medic working over her with controlled urgency. Through the open door, she could see the valley falling away below, could see the scattered bodies of enemy fighters and the smoke still rising from artillery strikes. Could see, in the distance, the rock face where she'd painted her final report in blood. Lieutenant Reeves was waiting on the landing pad when the medical helicopter touched down. He'd been part of the recovery team authorization, had personally requested permission to accompany the evacuation, but Wolf had ordered him to remain at base command. Now he stood with a dozen other soldiers, all watching as the medical team rushed Irene's stretcher toward the base hospital. He caught only a glimpse of her, pale, smaller than he remembered, covered in blood and bandages. She was unconscious, her face slack in a way that suggested she might not wake up again. The medics were moving with the controlled urgency that indicated critical condition, possibly minutes from losing her. "Will she make it?" Sergeant Voss asked quietly. He'd appeared beside Reeves without announcement, his usual aggressive posture absent. "I don't know," Reeves replied honestly. "The medic said she'd lost enough blood to kill most people twice over. The fact that she survived this long is miraculous." Voss stared at the hospital entrance long after the medical team had disappeared inside. "I called her emotional. Said she was too soft for combat operations. I was wrong about everything." "We were all wrong," Reeves said. "We mistook feeling deeply for weakness. We saw someone who cried and assumed she couldn't handle pressure. We never considered that maybe feeling things intensely meant she cared more, tried harder, refused to quit even when quitting would have been easier." The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. It was going to be a beautiful day, sunny and clear. The kind of day that made you forget you were in a war zone until something reminded you. "Captain wants to see you," Voss finally said. "About Hill's intelligence reports. About everything she tried to tell us before last night." Reeves nodded and headed toward the command center. Inside, he found Wolf surrounded by tactical displays showing the aftermath of the morning's artillery strikes. The coordinated assault had been devastated. Enemy casualties were still being counted, but preliminary estimates suggested over 200 fighters had been neutralized before they could threaten the base. "Reeves," Wolf said without preamble. "Walk me through Hill's analysis. All of it. From the beginning." For the next hour, Reeves laid out everything Irene had documented over the past 2 weeks. The pattern recognition. The movement analysis. The predictive modeling that had identified Sector 12 as the actual threat while everyone else focused on Sector 9. He pulled up her reports, highlighted her observations, showed exactly how thorough and accurate her work had been. "She knew," Wolf said quietly when Reeves finished. "She knew exactly what was happening, and we dismissed her because she cried during briefings." "Yes, sir." "How many soldiers would have died this morning if she hadn't painted that map?" Reeves had already done the math. Conservative estimate, based on the enemy force size and positioning. 50 to 70 killed. Another 100 wounded. Possibly the complete loss of sections 3 and 4. The attack would have penetrated our perimeter defenses and reached the base interior. Wolf sat down heavily, suddenly looking much older than his 47 years. All that prevented by one analyst who refused to give up even while bleeding out on a mountainside. An analyst I told to focus on equipment manifests instead of operational intelligence. Sir, we can't change what happened. But we can change what happens next. What do you recommend? Reeves had been thinking about this since the moment he saw those blood-marked coordinates. Hill survives, we need to acknowledge what she did publicly. Not just a commendation, but recognition that changes how we evaluate soldiers. We need to stop confusing emotional expression with weakness. We need to value analytical intelligence as highly as physical strength. And if she doesn't survive? Wolf asked quietly. Then we make damn sure everyone knows what she did. We make sure her analysis methods get taught. We make sure no one else gets dismissed because they feel things too deeply or cry when they're overwhelmed or show vulnerability in a culture that mistakes it for incompetence. Wolf nodded slowly. Draft a commendation recommendation. I want it ready regardless of outcome. If Hill survives, she gets it pinned to her uniform in front of the entire base. If she doesn't survive, it goes in her permanent record and gets sent to her family with a full explanation of what she accomplished. Reeves saluted and turned to leave, but Wolf's voice stopped him at the door. Reeves, you told me she approached you before this happened. That she tried to convince you about Sector 12. Yes, sir. I said I'd mention it to you, but that she needed to stop showing her emotions so much. That every time she cried, she lost credibility. And what do you think now? Reeves looked back at his commanding officer. I think maybe the problem wasn't that she felt too much. I think maybe the problem was that we felt too little. Irene woke to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of medical monitors. Her first thought was surprise that she was thinking at all. Her second thought was pain, though it was distant now, muffled by whatever medications were flowing through the four-line in her arm. She tried to move and found her chest heavily bandaged, her right arm immobilized. A nurse appeared immediately in her field of vision, a woman with gray-streaked hair and efficient hands. Easy, Hill. Don't try to move yet. You've been in surgery for 6 hours. The doctors put you back together, but it was a close thing. How close? Irene's voice came out as a raspy whisper. The nurse adjusted something on the force stand. You'd lost nearly 40% of your blood volume. Another 10 minutes and we wouldn't have been able to save you. As it is, you're going to be recovering for months. Punctured lung, 3 broken ribs, severe tissue damage. You're lucky the bullet missed your heart by 3 centimeters. Lucky. Irene almost laughed but stopped when she felt how much it would hurt. She'd never felt less lucky in her life, though she supposed being alive at all counted for something. How long have I been unconscious? 36 hours. We kept you sedated after surgery to let your body start healing without the stress of consciousness. The nurse checked her vitals, made notes on a tablet. You've had a lot of visitors. Captain Wolf has been by 3 times. Lieutenant Reeves practically lived in the waiting room. Half the base has asked about you. That information took longer to process. Half the base. The same people who dismissed her as emotional, too soft, too weak. Now they were asking about her. The map, Irene said suddenly, memory flooding back. The blood coordinates. Did they work? Did Sentinel hold? The nurse smiled, and there was something like pride in her expression. The map worked perfectly. Every coordinate was accurate. The artillery strikes destroyed the enemy force before they could launch their assault. You saved approximately 200 lives, Hill. Probably more when you count the wounded who would have died in a full-scale attack. 200 lives. The number seemed abstract, impossible. Irene tried to imagine 200 people, tried to visualize that many soldiers who were alive because she'd refused to die quietly. The weight of it was enormous. There's someone who wants to see you, the nurse said. If you're up for a visitor. He's been waiting since you came out of surgery. Who? Captain Wolf. Should I send him in? Irene wanted to say no, wanted more time to prepare for facing the commanding officer who'd dismissed her analysis and told her to focus on equipment manifests. But she also wanted answers, wanted to understand what happened after she lost consciousness on that mountainside. Send him in. Wolf entered a minute later, and Irene was struck by how tired he looked. He'd aged visibly in the past 2 days, new lines around his eyes and mouth. He stood at the foot of her bed for a long moment before speaking. Hill. How are you feeling? Like I got shot, sir. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I suppose that's accurate. The doctors say you'll make a full recovery, though it'll take time. Yes, sir. Wolf pulled a chair over and sat down, his posture less rigid than she'd ever seen it. I came to apologize. For not listening to your analysis. For dismissing your concerns about Sector 12. For telling you to focus on your assigned duties when you were trying to save lives. For contributing to a culture that mistook your emotional expression for weakness. Irene stared at him, unsure how to respond. In all her months at Sentinel, she'd never heard Wolf apologize for anything. You were right about everything, he continued. The pattern analysis. The enemy positioning. The coordinated assault. You tried to warn us, and we wouldn't listen because we couldn't see past our own biases about what makes a good soldier. I cried during briefings, Irene said quietly. I got emotional when I should have stayed professional. I understand why people question my reliability. No, Wolf said firmly. You felt things deeply, which made you care more about getting it right. You were emotional because you understood the stakes, because you knew lives depended on your analysis being correct. We mistook passion for instability. We were wrong. The weight of his words settled over the room. Irene had spent so long trying to prove herself, trying to show that her emotions didn't make her weak, that hearing validation from the person who'd dismissed her most thoroughly felt surreal. What happens now? She asked. Now you recover. And when you're ready, we talk about your future. Because Hill, you're not going back to logistics. You're being transferred to strategic intelligence, where your analytical skills can be properly utilized. We're also implementing new evaluation protocols based on what happened. No more dismissing soldiers because they show emotion. No more confusing feeling deeply with being weak. Irene closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted. I just wanted to do my job, sir. I just wanted people to listen. They're listening now, Wolf said quietly. Everyone's listening now. 3 weeks after waking up, Irene was finally cleared to leave the hospital for short walks around the base. She moved slowly, her chest still heavily bandaged, but the doctors were pleased with her recovery. The punctured lung had healed cleanly, and the broken ribs were knitting together properly. Lieutenant Reeves volunteered to accompany her on her first walk outside, claiming he needed the exercise. They moved at her pace through the base, past buildings she'd known for months but somehow looked different now. People stare, Irene observed as another group of soldiers watched them pass, some nodding respectfully. You're famous, Reeves replied. The analyst who painted a battlefield with her own blood. There's already talk of making your methods part of advanced intelligence training. How to maximize intelligence gathering with minimal resources. I didn't plan it that way. I was just trying not to die uselessly. That's what makes it remarkable. You transformed your death into something useful. You turned your final minutes into an intelligence report that saved hundreds of lives. Reeves paused at the edge of the training grounds. Can I ask you something? Yes, sir. When you were up there, bleeding out, painting those coordinates, were you scared? Irene considered the question carefully. I was terrified. The whole time. From the moment the attack started until I lost consciousness. But being scared didn't stop me from doing what needed to be done. I think maybe that's what courage actually is. Not the absence of fear, but refusing to let fear make your decisions. They walked in silence for a while, watching new recruits run through basic training exercises. Irene remembered her own training, remembered being the one who struggled most with the physical components, who cried when instructors yelled at her, who everyone assumed would wash out. I heard they're bringing in investigators, she said. About my unauthorized departure from base. About disobeying orders to stay in position. Reeves nodded. Standard procedure for any disciplinary review. But Hill, you need to understand something. You're not being investigated for punishment. You're being investigated so they can formally document that you acted correctly under the circumstances. It's the difference between court-martial and commendation. Which do you think it'll be? Commendation. Definitely commendation. Wolf is personally recommending you for the Soldier's Medal. That's the highest honor for non-combat heroism. They give it to people who risk their lives to save others. Irene absorbed this information slowly. She'd spent so long being dismissed, being underestimated, that the idea of receiving a formal commendation felt impossible. Like something that happened to other soldiers, the ones who fit the traditional mold of heroism. I don't feel like a hero, she said quietly. I feel like someone who got lucky. Luck was being found before you bled out, Reeves corrected. Everything else was skill, preparation, and determination. You spent months developing capabilities no one asked you to develop. You studied terrain everyone said was unimportant. You prepared for situations people said would never happen. When the moment came, you were ready because you'd made yourself ready. They reached the area where the observation posts were visible on the distant ridgeline. Irene could see OP-12's location, or what remained of it. The destroyed structure had been left as it was, too dangerous to access while the valley was still being cleared of enemy remnants. Do you want to go back up there? Reeves asked. Eventually, I mean. To see the site. I don't know. Part of me wants to see it in daylight, to understand what I did in a way I couldn't when I was doing it. Part of me never wants to see that place again. She touched her bandaged chest absently. Is it true they're using my blood map in training materials? Photographs of it, yes. With your permission, obviously. They want to show intelligence analysts what's possible when standard communication fails. How to improvise intelligence gathering with whatever resources are available. Resources being my blood. Resources being your intelligence, your training, and your refusal to give up. The blood was just the medium. Reeves turned to face her directly. Hill, I need to tell you something. Before all this happened, you came to me with your analysis of Sector 12. I told you that you needed to stop showing your emotions, that every time you cried you lost credibility. I was wrong to say that, and I'm sorry. You were trying to help me succeed in the system as it existed. I was trying to make you fit into a broken system instead of challenging the system itself. That's different from helping you succeed. He paused, choosing his words carefully. After what happened, I've been thinking a lot about emotional intelligence. About how feeling things deeply can actually make you better at your job, not worse. You cared enough to prepare thoroughly. You felt the weight of responsibility strongly enough to push past pain and fear. Your emotions didn't make you weak. They made you strong in ways we couldn't see. Irene felt tears building and didn't try to stop them. For months, she'd fought to hide her feelings, to present the stoic facade everyone expected. Now, standing in the sunshine with bandages covering the wound she'd earned saving people who'd dismissed her, she let herself cry openly. Thank you, she said simply. Reeves nodded, not uncomfortable with her tears the way he might have been a month ago. Let's get you back to the hospital. You've been walking for 30 minutes, and the doctors said to start slow. As they turned back, Irene took one last look at the distant ridgeline, at the place where she'd transformed from the emotional analyst into something else entirely. Something that had always been there, waiting for the moment when being dismissed no longer mattered as much as being right. The formal inquiry took place 6 weeks after the attack, held in Sentinel's main briefing room with military investigators from Regional Command. Irene sat at a table facing a panel of 3 officers, her chest still bound though she'd been cleared to return to light duty. Captain Wolf sat to her right as her commanding officer. Lieutenant Reeves was present as a witness. Colonel Hayes, the lead investigator, opened the proceedings with formal language about unauthorized departure from base and failure to follow direct orders. But his tone suggested this was procedural rather than accusatory. Specialist Hill, can you explain in your own words why you chose to leave Forward Operating Base Sentinel without authorization on the night of the attack? Irene had prepared for this question, had rehearsed her answer, but now that the moment arrived, she abandoned the prepared statement. Sir, I believe that Pilot Jackson and potentially my entire base would die if I didn't act. I had the skills and knowledge necessary to reach the observation post, and I believe the potential benefit outweighed the risks of unauthorized action. You were specifically ordered to remain on base. You acknowledged that order. Then you violated it. Yes, sir. I made a choice to prioritize saving lives over following an order I believed was given without full understanding of the situation. One of the other investigators, a stern woman named Colonel Pierce, leaned forward. That's a dangerous precedent, Specialist. If every soldier decided for themselves which orders to follow, military discipline would collapse. I agree, ma'am. I'm not suggesting soldiers should routinely ignore orders. I'm saying that in extreme circumstances, when lives are in immediate danger and you possess unique capabilities to help, there's a moral imperative that supersedes normal discipline. And who decides when circumstances are extreme enough? Pierce pressed. The person on the ground with the relevant information and capabilities, Irene replied. Which in this case was me. I had studied that terrain for months. I knew the approach routes. I had the climbing skills necessary to reach the observation post. And I knew that waiting for standard rescue operations meant watching people die when I could prevent it. Hayes consulted his notes. Your analysis of Sector 12 proved accurate. Can you explain why you believed you were correct when your commanding officers disagreed? I didn't believe I was correct, sir. I knew I was correct. The data was clear, the patterns were unmistakable. The issue wasn't the quality of my analysis. The issue was that my analysis was being dismissed because of who delivered it rather than what it contained. The room fell silent. Irene had just accused her superiors of bias, but she'd done it calmly, stating it as fact rather than complaint. Wolf shifted beside her. For the record, Hill's assessment is accurate. I dismissed her analysis because I had preconceived notions about her reliability based on her emotional expression during briefings. I was wrong to do so. Hayes made notes, then pulled up a series of photographs on the display screen. The blood map. 17 sets of coordinates painted across pale granite and dark streaks that were clearly visible even in the photographs. Let's discuss the intelligence gathering method you employed. Can you walk us through your decision-making process? Irene studied the images, seeing her work from the outside for the first time. It looked more precise than she remembered, more deliberate. Hard to believe she'd created that while bleeding out. After I was shot, I lost my radio and most of my equipment. But I had clear visibility of enemy positions staging for assault. I had intelligence training in coordinate marking and aerial reconnaissance. And I had blood, which was the only medium available. The logical choice was to use what I had to create an intelligence report that could be read from the air. Logical, Pierce repeated, her tone skeptical. Most people in your situation would have focused on survival, not intelligence gathering. Survival and intelligence gathering weren't separate goals, ma'am. If the enemy assault succeeded, I would have died anyway, either from my wounds or from being overrun. My only chance of survival was ensuring Sentinel received warning in time to neutralize the threat. Creating the blood map served both purposes. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her. You understand that what you did, while effective, violated numerous protocols. You left base without authorization. You conducted a solo operation without backup or support. You engaged in tactical intelligence gathering outside your designated role. Any one of those violations would normally result in disciplinary action. Yes, sir. I understand. However, Hayes continued, your actions directly resulted in saving approximately 200 lives and preventing a potentially catastrophic breach of base security. The question before this panel is whether your violations of protocol were justified by the outcome, or whether the outcome simply obscures serious disciplinary issues. Irene understood what he was really asking. Was she a hero who should be celebrated, or a problem soldier who happened to get lucky? Sir, I can't tell you whether what I did was justified. That's not my judgment to make. What I can tell you is that I would make the same choice again under the same circumstances. Because some things are more important than protocol. Saving lives is more important than following orders. Being right is more important than being comfortable. And sometimes doing your job means exceeding your assigned role because the situation demands it. Colonel Pierce's expression softened slightly. Even if it means dying in the process? Especially then, ma'am. Because if I'm going to die anyway, I'd rather die accomplishing something meaningful than die following orders that I know are wrong. The three investigators exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Hayes spoke. This panel has reviewed all evidence regarding Specialist Hill's actions during the attack on Observation Post 12 and the subsequent intelligence gathering operation. We find that while her violations of protocol are serious and cannot be dismissed, they were undertaken with the clear intention of preserving life and completing her intelligence mission under extraordinary circumstances. He paused, and Irene held her breath. Therefore, this panel recommends that no disciplinary action be taken, and further recommends that Specialist Hill be commended for exceptional courage and initiative in the performance of her duties. The specifics of that commendation will be determined by base command. Relief flooded through Irene, though she kept her expression neutral. Not punishment. Not discharge. Recognition instead. Thank you, sir, she said quietly. The commendation ceremony took place on a bright morning 3 months after the attack. Irene stood in her dress uniform, the fabric still feeling strange against the healing scars on her chest. The entire base had assembled on the parade ground, hundreds of soldiers arranged in precise formations. She'd been told what to expect, had rehearsed her part in the ceremony, but nothing quite prepared her for the reality of standing in front of everyone who'd once dismissed her while Captain Wolfe read the citation for the soldier's medal. For heroism not involving actual conflict with an enemy, Specialist Irene Hill distinguished herself through exceptional courage and initiative during the attack on Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Despite being severely wounded, Specialist Hill utilized available resources to create an intelligence report that directly resulted in the preservation of 200 Allied lives and the prevention of a catastrophic breach of base security. Wolfe's voice carried across the parade ground, strong and clear. Her actions demonstrate the highest standards of military service and personal courage. Her innovative approach to intelligence gathering under extreme circumstances has been incorporated into advanced training protocols. Her refusal to accept traditional limitations has fundamentally changed how this command evaluates capability and potential. The medal itself was simple, a bronze star suspended from a ribbon of blue and red. But as Wolfe pinned it to her uniform, Irene felt the weight of everything it represented. Not just her actions on that ridgeline, but the months of preparation that made those actions possible. Not just the blood map, but every analysis she'd completed that no one read, every skill she developed that no one valued, every moment she'd cried and been dismissed as too emotional for combat. Specialist Hill, Wolfe said quietly, for her ears only. You changed this base. You changed how we think about strength and capability and courage. Thank you. Irene saluted crisply, then stepped back into formation. The ceremony continued with other commendations, other recognitions, but she barely heard them. Her mind was on the future, on the strategic intelligence position waiting for her, on the analysts she'd be training in pattern recognition and creative problem solving. 6 months after the ceremony, Irene stood in front of a classroom full of intelligence analysts, her first official training session as an instructor. The wound had healed completely, leaving only a scar she sometimes traced with her fingers as a reminder of what she'd survived. Pattern recognition isn't just about seeing data, she told the assembled analysts, most of whom were older than her, many with more years of service. It's about understanding context, about recognizing when something that looks normal is actually significant. About trusting your analysis even when everyone else dismisses it. She pulled up a series of thermal imaging reports on the display screen. 6 months ago, I identified an enemy buildup in Sector 12. Everyone told me I was wrong. That I was seeing patterns that weren't there. That my analysis was based on feelings rather than facts. The analysts watched attentively. Everyone knew her story by now. The blood map had become legendary, taught in intelligence schools across the military as an example of innovative problem-solving under extreme conditions. But I wasn't working from feelings. I was working from data that I'd spent months learning to interpret correctly. The thermal signatures, the movement patterns, the timing of repositioning, all of it pointed to a coordinated assault. The problem wasn't my analysis. The problem was that people couldn't separate the quality of my work from their perception of who I was. A hand went up in the back. Corporal Davis, the same soldier who'd questioned her dedication months ago in that briefing room. He'd been one of the first to request transfer to her training program. "Ma'am, how do you get people to listen when they've already decided you're not credible?" Irene smiled at the question. "You don't. You can't force people to respect your analysis through argument or emotion. What you can do is be so thoroughly prepared, so completely right, that eventually the evidence speaks for itself. And in the meantime, you keep doing the work because it matters, whether anyone acknowledges it or not." She advanced to the next slide, showing the blood map photographs. Some of the analysts shifted uncomfortably. The images were striking, undeniably powerful in their stark documentation of coordinates painted in blood. "This wasn't Plan A," Irene said quietly. "Plan A was presenting my analysis through proper channels and having it taken seriously. Plan B was gathering first-hand intelligence from the observation post. The blood map was Plan C, improvised when everything else failed. The lesson isn't that you should plan to paint coordinates in blood. The lesson is that you should be prepared to adapt your methods to whatever circumstances you face." Lieutenant Reeves entered the classroom and stood at the back, observing. He'd been promoted after the Sector 12 incident, now overseeing all intelligence operations for the base. He'd personally requested that Irene be given this training position, had fought to overcome objections that she was too young, too inexperienced, too unconventional. "Questions?" Irene asked the class. The new assignment took Irene to the northern border regions, where 3 countries met in disputed territory that changed hands with the seasons. She spent 8 months there, leading an intelligence team that identified and neutralized threats before they materialized. Her methods became standard protocol, thorough preparation, pattern recognition, and the willingness to trust analysis over assumptions. She didn't paint any more coordinates in blood, didn't need to. But she kept the scar on her ribcage as a reminder of what she'd proven that sunny morning when everyone said something was impossible and she did it anyway. When she returned to Sentinel for reassignment, the base had changed. More women in intelligence roles. More emphasis on analytical capability over physical presence. More acceptance that strength manifested in different forms, that courage wasn't always loud, that the soldiers who felt things deeply often cared the most about getting it right. Sergeant Voss approached her in the mess hall one evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her without asking permission to sit. "Hill. Heard you did good work up north." "Thank you, Sergeant." Voss stirred sugar into his coffee, not meeting her eyes. "I wanted to apologize. For calling you emotional. For making you feel like caring too much was a weakness. I was wrong. You weren't alone in thinking that. Maybe not. But I was vocal about it. Made it harder for you to do your job." He finally looked at her. "The thing is, after what happened, after I saw what you did, I started paying attention to the analysts we were dismissing. Found a pattern. The ones we questioned most were often the ones doing the best work. We were filtering out competence because it didn't look the way we expected. And now we're changing how we evaluate people. Looking at results instead of presentation. Valuing preparation over confidence. Recognizing that someone who cries during briefings might care more about the mission than someone who doesn't." He stood up, coffee in hand. Anyway, I wanted you to know. What you did mattered beyond just that one mission. After he left, Irene sat alone with her coffee and thought about the journey from that first week when she'd cried 3 times and earned her nickname. She thought about the observation post, about the moment the bullet tore through her ribs, about the choice she'd made to transform dying into something useful. The emotional Irene was still there, still felt things deeply, still cried sometimes during briefings when the weight of responsibility became overwhelming. But now people understood that her emotions weren't weakness. They were the fuel that drove her preparation, her dedication, her absolute refusal to let people die when she might prevent it. Lieutenant Reeves found her as the mess hall was emptying. Ready for tomorrow? Tomorrow was her promotion ceremony. She was being elevated to warrant officer, a technical expert rank that recognized her specialized knowledge. At 23, she'd be one of the youngest warrant officers in intelligence operations. Ready as I'll ever be. Nervous? Terrified, Irene admitted with a smile. But I've learned that being scared doesn't stop you from doing what needs to be done. They walked out into the evening air, the sun setting behind the same mountains where she nearly died 6 months ago. The observation post had been rebuilt, properly fortified this time, manned by analysts who understood that Sector 12 was never quiet, just overlooked. You changed this base, Reeves said. Changed how we think about capability and potential and courage. That's going to outlast all of us. I just wanted people to listen. They're listening now. Everyone's listening now. Irene looked up at the mountains, at the terrain she'd studied so obsessively, at the ridgeline where she'd painted her final report in blood. She thought about all the analysts who'd come after her, who'd benefit from the protocols she'd helped establish, who'd be evaluated on their capabilities rather than their emotional expression. She thought about her younger brother, still asking questions about war and bravery and fear. Someday she'd tell him the truth, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the refusal to let fear make your decisions. That strength came in unexpected forms. That being underestimated could be an advantage if you were patient enough, prepared enough, determined enough to wait for your moment. And when that moment came, when everyone said something was impossible and circumstances gave you one chance to prove them wrong, you took that chance with everything you had. Even if it meant painting a battlefield with your own blood. Even if it meant transforming dying into saving lives. Even if it meant becoming someone unrecognizable to show the world who you'd been all along. The sun set completely, and stars emerged over the mountains. Irene Hill, the analyst they'd called too emotional, too soft, too weak, stood watching the darkness settle over terrain she knew better than anyone. Tomorrow she'd be promoted. Next month she'd be training more analysts. Next year she'd be implementing new protocols across the entire region. But tonight, she was just a soldier who'd survived impossible odds because she'd prepared for them, who'd saved hundreds of lives because she'd refused to die quietly, who'd proven that being dismissed wasn't the same as being wrong. And that, Irene thought as she headed back to her quarters, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.